Welcome, welcome.
Hi.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome, welcome all. Those who were on before, and then I had to restart my computer. Hopefully you're able to join back again. So welcome. We'll get started right at 10:30. Welcome for those of you. I'm going to put the reflection sheet in the chat. We'll go over what that is and what that means. But for right now, if you just want to open it up, it'll force you to make a copy. Please don't start filling it out, obviously, but just dropped it in the chat. Welcome. We'll start in about 2 more minutes. Welcome all. We'll start in about 1 minute. I'm going to drop the reflection sheet in the chat. Obviously, please don't start filling it out quite yet, but it should force you to make a copy. So if you have not already done so, go ahead and get one, please. And we'll start right at 10:30. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started to honor your time. Now, I've said this a couple times, so I apologize those who've heard it 3 times, but I'm going to drop the reflection sheet in the chat. Please don't start filling it out yet, but it should force you to make a copy and we'll be using it throughout the presentation. Full disclosure, last presentation, I had a lot of trouble with my mouse. I was really had some trouble, so I restarted my computer. Hopefully we won't have these issues, but please bear with me. I apologize if there are issues. Fingers crossed there won't be. Okay, I'll drop the reflection sheet in about 1 more minute, but I'm gonna go ahead and start sharing my screen. Let me see. So welcome to this presentation of supporting multilingual learners in the mainstream classroom. My name is Cindy Demnicki. I am an ELD teacher at Snowden Farm Elementary School. I'll give you a little information about myself right now. So I'm in my 18th year of teaching. I have an undergraduate degree in elementary education from Millersville University in Pennsylvania. So anybody from Millersville, go Marauders. I have a master's degree in TESOL from the University of Maryland, go Terps, and I spent 15 years teaching 3rd, 4th, and 1st grade. So any teachers from Bradley Hills, Rachel Carson, and I don't think I'm currently at Snowden Farm. I don't think I've seen any from them, but welcome, welcome. This is my 3rd year as an ELD teacher. So I really put together this presentation because as a classroom teacher, I welcomed emergent multilingual learners in my classroom every year, and I never really understood how they were identified. I would get their proficiency level, but really didn't fully understand what that meant. And then I was always looking for strategies to work with my language learners. So hopefully this presentation will do all that. Again, I hope that I don't have any issues with technology like I did in the last one. So fingers crossed. Conditions for success. Please turn cameras on. I'm gonna put an asterisk around that because last presentation I was having trouble and someone said possibly with the cameras on, that might have been a cause of the issues. I would love to see your faces, but I would love to have success with my technology even more. So we'll see. I appreciate those of you that have it on. We'll see if this works, fingers crossed. And if it doesn't, I might ask you to turn them off. But if you do turn them off, I understand. Please mute unless talking. The chat feature is available. I am doing this on my own, and it's kind of had to come back into the swing of things with teaching via Zoom. So bear with me if I miss a chat or something like that. Please take responsibility for your learning, listen to learn, take risks, and be digitally responsible. So by the end of this presentation, you will be able to explain how a student is screened and identified for English language development services, understand the different ELD levels and explain what a student can likely do at each level, identify strategies for working with EMLs in the classroom, and then understand the process and outcomes of access testing. Because I am doing this alone, if any questions come up throughout the presentation, please fill out this Google form. I'll go ahead and put it into the chat. It is also on the reflection sheet, so I'm going to put both into the chat so that you can access it throughout the presentation. So this Google form with questions, I will get back to you as soon as I can. And then I'm going to put the reflection sheet back in the chat for anybody who just joined. Oops, bear with me 1 moment. One moment. There you go. I'm going to put the reflection sheet in the chat again. Okay. So as you can see, we just went over the objectives for the presentation. Here is the reflection sheet. Here, this link does link to the Google form. There's a Padlet, which we will get to in a little bit, so please don't click on that quite yet. Also, the parts where you're going to fill out the reflection sheet, please don't get to that yet. We will get to it. And then as you can see at the end of the presentation, there's a participant survey. So congratulations, you have an emergent multilingual learner in your classroom. Now what? We're going to watch a video that kind of gives you some perspective of what it's like for a newcomer. And I will admit it's a bit grainy, it's a little bit old, so I apologize, but it's a very powerful video. So please push aside the non-HD and just take a look at what I'm trying to share here. And let's hope this works, because unfortunately it did not work very well in my last presentation.
یکی نبود غیر از خدا هیچ کس نبود توی شهر دور یک پنگوئن بود و یک کودک پنگوئن فقط دوست داشت کلا بخوره غذاشم فقط شکلات بود و آب نبات و چیپس همیشه سرش
Yes, thank you to Kim. If you guys could turn off your cameras at least during this video, hopefully that will help be a little bit more successful. And can you give me a thumbs up, whether just through the little emojis or whatever? Can you hear the video, or can someone put in the chat that you can hear?
Yes, we can hear.
Thank you very much.
درد میکرد همیشه دلش درد میکرد توی مدرسه‌ام هیچ شاگرد خوبی نبود و درس نمیتونست بخونه در عوض اردک فقط آب پرتقال میخورد سیب دوست داشت بخوره گلابی میخورد گندم میخورد و نون رو دوست داشت بخوره خیلی ورزش میکرد میدونید حالش خوب بود توی مدرسه‌ام خیلی شاگرد خوبی بود.
Okay, now I'm going to stop it there for a minute. And does anybody want to take a risk, put in the chat, speak verbally what you think that was about? Can speak verbally, you can just unmute or put in the chat. What do you think?
That's how we sound to the students.
Ah, yes, especially our newcomers, but yes, sometimes even not just level 1 students, but other students when you're getting into that deep content, most definitely. Anybody else?
She was talking very passionately, and you could see her gestures. So it almost sounded like she was telling a story, but of course I don't know what she was saying, so I'm not sure.
Good, I like that. Yes, and it's interesting that you say the gestures, because we're going to continue watching and see how the body language and realia helps. So I'll keep playing.
Now I'm going to present to you the same lesson in a different manner. یکی بود یکی نبود غیر از خدا هیچ کس نبود توی یک شهر دور یک پنگوئن بود و یک اردک پنگوئن فقط دوست داشت کلا بخوره غذاشم فقط شکلات بود و آب نبات و چیپس پنگوئن همیشه خسته بود سرش درد میکرد دلش درد میکرد تو مدرسه‌ام هیچ شاگرد خوبی نبود وقتی که میشست مدادش رو دست میگرفت ولی بعد از 2 دقیقه دهن دره میکرد میگفت سرم درد میکنه سرش رو میگذاشت روی کتاب و میگفت بهتره چرت بزنم در عوض اردک همیشه آب پرتقال میخورد سیب رو خیلی دوست داشت بخوره گلابی میخورد نون خوب میخورد گندم میخورد. همیشه حالش خوب بود. ورزش میکرد. میدوید. هیچ وقتم مریض نمیشد. توی مدرسه هم شاگرد خیلی خوبی بود. مدادش رو دست میگرفت. تند و تند درسش رو میخوند و مینوشت. همیشه توی مدرسه نمره های خیلی خوب داشت. شاگردام همیشه براش دست میزدن.
Okay. Obviously a little different, a little bit more information there. Does anybody want to take a guess as to what they were possibly talking about as you saw the body language and the realia and all that? And again, you can put in the chat, you can just unmute. Okay, so we have healthy versus unhealthy food.
The effects of eating healthy versus unhealthy foods.
Yep, exactly. And as you can see, someone said at the beginning, when we watched the first half of it, you know, what it's like for newcomers and language learners and how beneficial it can be to use body language and realia and the expression in your voice. It can really make a difference. So that's one of the things we're going to be looking at today. So we are going to go to our reflection sheet, and you know MCPS is full of acronyms, so there are all sorts of acronyms for the ELD program. So I'm going to ask you on your reflection sheet, and again, I'll put it in the chat, just fill out this part here that says, what do you think each acronym stands for? And I'll give you about 2 minutes to fill it out. Hopefully some of this looks familiar, some of it you may have never seen before. So go ahead, I'm going to put it back in the chat, but you can start filling this out and then we'll go over it together. Okay, so it's just been put in the chat. Take about another minute. Okay, about a little over 15 seconds to start to wrap up. Okay, so let's go over these and see how you did. ESOL, hopefully you are familiar with. If you've been in the county for even just a couple years, that is something that we used. ESOL stands for English for Speakers of Other Languages. And EML, if you've been listening carefully, I have used that already in this presentation. Emergent Multilingual Learners. And then also ELD, I have been using the presentation, which stands for English Language Development. Now, if you've noticed this school year, we started to move away from using the acronym ESOL and more into ELD. We're trying to take a more asset-based approach as opposed to ESOL can be a little bit more deficit focused when you're speaking other languages. We recognize that students come into school sometimes bilingual, trilingual. I have a student who I screened that could speak 4 different languages. So we want to focus on the English language development and the fact that they're multilingual learners and really focus on all the assets of what they can do. Now, REL, it's a little bit harder. Does anybody want to put in the chat or unmute? What do you think REL stands for? And I saw a couple ELD teachers, so hold off those ELD teachers, but anybody else, what do you think REL stands for? This one's a little bit more challenging. Okay, so I understand this one's tough. REL stands for Reclassified English Learner. It's those who've exited from the ELD program. And we'll talk about what it means to how they can exit from the program. They still can, while they're not getting direct English language development instruction, they can still benefit from guides and scaffolds and all that. So something to keep in mind if you do have students who are classified as REL, they would still definitely benefit from those strategies and scaffolds. And then ESOL level 10. Anybody know what an ESOL level 10 student is? Still see it on forms as ESOL level 10, probably should be ELD level 10. Good. Parent opts out. Yes. Parent exit. Excellent. Not quite exit though, but the opt out students who their parents refuse services on the parent notification letter. They can still be assigned accommodations on the EL plan. They will still be expected to take the annual language assessment each year, access, which we'll talk about at the end of the presentation. They are required to take it, but their parents can refuse services. So they can, as I said, can be assigned accommodations. That's up to the classroom teacher and the ELD teacher, but they must take the annual language assessment. Okay, so now that we know about the acronyms, I have a Padlet here and it is linked on your reflection sheet, but I'll also put the link in the chat here. What comes to mind when you hear the term emergent multilingual learner? Now, the Padlet I'm going to share with you, it does have answers from my last presentation. If you agree with anything, feel free to click on the little heart. But go ahead and on your reflection sheet, and I'm going to put this, as I said, in the chat, what comes to mind when you hear emergent multilingual learner? And I'll put the timer on for 1 minute. And like someone else's, if you still have time. Nope. And can't watch it, that's all right. Okay, there you go. Students who are developing their language skills in more than one language, whose primary language is not English. I love this. Student who's making progress, learning and understanding multiple languages. Working on, it's hard to read as they change. Spanish, visuals, vocabulary, language difference, not disorder. I love that. Working on learning about their world in more than one language. Yes, because it's their whole world. I like that. Developing more than one language. Excellent. Becoming more proficient in their English learning. I love that word, more proficient. Yes, because for many of them, they have some proficiency. And for those who are complete newcomers, they will become more proficient as they progress. Okay, thank you. I love your responses. It's definitely, I see an asset-based approach to this, so that makes my heart happy. Okay, so now we're going, oh, 1 moment. Look at the reflection sheet, and I'm going to ask you, now this is not turned in or anything like that, but it's just a time for you to reflect as an educator. Think of a time in which you worked with an email in the classroom or in a small group. What was your experience? What worked well? What did not? And then what do you know about how EMLs are identified for ELD services? So just take some time, again, just to kind of reflect. We're going to come back to that bottom question at the end of the presentation. So I'll put the timer on for 2 minutes. I'll drop I'll probably have to start the timer again, but I'll drop the reflection sheet again in the chat. for those who've just joined or somehow got signed out. Okay, it was just dropped in the chat. Okay, about 30 more seconds. Finish up any thoughts. Okay, start to wrap up your thoughts. Okay. Okay, so again, this is not submit or anything, but it's just for you to think. And as I said, we will come back to this at the end of the presentation. Oh, and here we go. Okay, so now we're going to get into, we've talked about the acronyms. Now we're going to get into how students are screened for services. So when parents are enrolling their children in MCPS, they are asked the following question on what is called the Home Language Survey, or HLS. So what language or languages did they first learn to speak? Do they use most often? Which language? And then what languages are spoken in the home? If a language other than English is indicated on 2 or more of the questions, then we must screen them for services. And this is not a choice, it is a requirement. What I have found in my experience with this is that sometimes the information can be different. You might have siblings that have completely different answers on the HLS, and it could be the way that the parent interprets the question that day, or who fills out the HLS for their given child. So sometimes it can be a little frustrating, because I will get parents who teachers who say, I'm noticing some of the language development errors and things like that, and I am not able to screen them, unfortunately, if their HLS does not have 2 questions that have a language other than English. So that is something to keep in mind, that unfortunately it's not always consistent. And that can be frustrating, because you want to be able to provide the supports for the students. But if they are identified as being screened, we give what is called the WIDA screener. For first semester kindergarten students, it is listening and speaking only. We do not expect kindergartners to be able to read and write, obviously, so it is just listening and speaking. Sometimes what that means is that when they take the access test in the winter, and then they get their updated proficiency level in the spring, their level may go down, because by winter on access, they are expected to do the reading and writing. So sometimes parents don't understand how a student's, or teachers don't understand how a student's score can, proficiency level can go down after spending a year in schools, but that does happen because you add that sometimes more challenging component of reading and writing. Students in grades 1 through 5, and then second semester kindergarten students are given speaking, listening, reading, and writing. And I will say it's relatively interesting for the students. I mean, considering it's a test, there's an illustrated story with questions. They have cards that they move around and place on things. They're asked to write a story. And so for the most part, it's not too bad for a screener, but it gives us good data. So English proficiency is calculated, as you can see. Literacy, or the reading and writing, has more weight than speaking and listening, which also plays a role because sometimes teachers will say, but my student can speak to me, they can talk about, content, but if they're reading and writing, which can be more challenging when you're learning a language, if their abilities are lower, then that will affect their overall score. And then you get a proficiency level, and this is just one document that can kind of show you their general level. You can see it starts at 1 for entering and works its way up to 6 for reaching. And at level 1, they might use words, phrases, or chunks of language, which then starts to proceed into phrases and short sentences. And as they go up in the levels, then they can start using a variety of sentence length, some technical language, some specific language. Students who score 4.5 or higher on the screener do not qualify for services, because as you can see, then they're getting close to or comparable to English proficient peers. So they must score lower than a 4.5 to qualify for services. And WIDA put out what's called the can-do descriptors, which provide examples of what language learners can do at various levels. This is an example for 3rd grade, reading specifically, and it shows you like a level 1 all the way up to a level 5. So for instance, a level 1 student might be able to match illustrated words and phrases. And then by level 2, they can start identifying the story elements, characters, setting, plot, problem, solution. And as they start to work their way up, they can start finding details, support main ideas, and then draw conclusions. So this can be really helpful as a teacher to see where a student may be and where they're working towards. And it also is different for different domains. For example, this is the can-do descriptors for grades 2 to 3. And if I scroll down here, you can see that they also break it down more specifically into the key use of recounting. So being able to kind of retell, and they have it for speaking, listening, reading, and writing. But then they also have it for explaining. And again, speaking, listening, reading, and writing. And then arguing. And what they've done is they've broken this down for kindergarten. They have it for 1st grade. They have grades 2 to 3, which is what this example is. And then they have grades 4 and 5. And so it really does help you kind of see, like, they can identify the who, where, when of illustrated sentences, and they're working on adding linking phrases like on Monday or tomorrow, kind of thing like that. So this can be very beneficial. Your ELD teachers should have this in their files, but if I'm happy to provide it, if you have any, if you'd like a copy specific to your grade level, if you want to put it in the questions, I'm happy to send it to you. But as I said, your ELD teachers do have it as well. And that can just be really beneficial in understanding your students might be at a different proficiency level for listening than they are for reading and writing, and where they might be. Okay, so now we've talked about screening, we've talked about proficiency levels. Now we're going to talk about some strategies for working with multilingual learners. So word banks, I'm sure many of you use word banks, but they can be really powerful and beneficial for students. This one is one that I used for 1st grade about community gardens. And I made sure, because they're 1st graders, to provide pictures as well as some words that they can use. And then here's one I used for 2nd grade with stone soup. And the word bank here, not all of the words apply. But they have to be able to find the appropriate word and then support it with details from the text. So it kind of just takes off some of that, the challenge that can come there, but they're still using their critical thinking skills. And similar to that is cognate charts, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. They identify words in one language that are very similar to English. A lot of times you'll find this in Spanish, might be in French. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work for all languages, obviously, but it can be beneficial. And it can make learning easier, like to understand a new vocabulary word. So this is one from Benchmark, 4th grade, Unit 5. And as you can see, there's some really high content words that it can be challenging. So to be able to understand because they have some background knowledge in their native language can be really beneficial. But be careful of false cognates. For example, this word looks like it's embarrassed, and it actually means pregnant. So you want to be careful of how you use them, make sure that they are true cognates, but they can be very beneficial. And as I said, benchmark does have, at least for Spanish. Honor the silent period. Some newcomers will go through a silent period, which they do not produce any verbal language, and this is okay. It's part of the developmental process for learning a language. So don't like necessarily push them till they're ready. I mean, you can obviously give them a little rigor and kind of, but don't push them too hard. I found last week I was working with a student and I found I was almost pushing them too hard, and I had to kind of step back and say, Cindy, let them get there where they need to. And by earlier, well, today's Monday, last week, they were he was starting to at least repeat after me. So we're working through it, but it is something to respect because they will get there. Paraphrase. Paraphrasing is really beneficial. Example, great job, Amina. So what you're saying is that, blank. It's good for students to hear the appropriate verb tenses, appropriate grammatical form, and sentence structure. So paraphrasing is really beneficial. You can also, I highly recommend explicitly correcting. If a student, he runs away from me or he run away from me, I will correct them. He runs away from me. Being very specific in that correction is very helpful for them. They hear the correct form. They need that explicit correction or the explicit paraphrasing to hear that. So sometimes people might be a little hesitant to correct them. You don't want to make students feel embarrassed, but I generally find that they repeat it after me in the correct form. And I think that they like to hear the correct form. Sentence patterning chart. I love sentence patterning charts. It's my goal to use this more this year. And as you can see, it's a great way to incorporate grammar, but there's other ways that you can use as well. So for instance, you might say the soft animals play quietly in the cave. And you're identifying all sorts of different components of grammar, but also helping them to produce more complex sentences. And I have a video here. Hopefully it works because last time it did not. So fingers crossed, of how this was from a newcomers course I took over the summer, and it was really powerful. So fingers crossed.
This is a chart I used with second graders when they were working on a few different grammatical things. They were working on singular and plural nouns. They were working on different verb forms. So we had present progressive, we had singular present progressive and plural present progressive. They brainstormed adjectives, and then the prepositional phrases had to do with the content knowledge that they had learned about where these particular vegetables grew. So I have some images that show the vegetables so that they can see and they can recall what we had talked about, and then they can put together their sentences. So the delicious carrots grow underground. And we talked a lot about how if we're talking about one noun, the verb has the S on the end. If we're talking about more than one and there's a plural, it does not have the S on the end. So again, one of the things I like about sentence patterning charts is that we're not just focusing on the grammar, we're really integrating the grammar into sentences that focus on the content that they're learning about. And so it's a easy way or a supported way for them to put together sentences, but they can't just do it randomly. Their sentences have to make sense. So they have to think carefully about which words they choose from each column so that the overall sentence makes sense.
Okay. So I really love that. One thing you can also do with it is when you're talking about like irregular past tense verbs, you can see, for instance, you could have put C on a post-it note, and under it would be the past tense saw. So the small animals see or look. I guess C would work, but run, we'll say, run carefully on the grass. And if it's in the past tense, they would have to change it to ran carefully. So it's a really great way, not only just to come up with adjectives, nouns, and all that, but also subject verb agreement, past tense, regular and irregular, all of that. So it's a really great way to incorporate so much into their writing or their speaking. Building background knowledge. Now, I know that with Benchmark, it's hard to find the time to really to build that background knowledge, but it is so beneficial for language learners. With my fourth graders last year, they learned about the Transcontinental Railroad. All the fourth grade teachers, I'm sure you know that. So we took the time to look at TrueFlix here, which is one of the apps that we have. They watched a video about it, they read about it. So when it came time to reading the Benchmark text about it, they had that background knowledge in there. And so they could then look at the language structure and make sure they were producing appropriate language. And it did take time to stop and do this, but it was so powerful because they were able to make connections to what they read in Benchmark with what they saw in here. This is one of the apps that we have, I know at my school. I hope that you guys have it too, because it is really powerful. A Realia Wordwall is so cool. It's one of my goals to get this going. If anybody's seen this, could you maybe drop in the chat what you've seen, but this is really cool where you actually put like Realia, real things on a bulletin board to make learning real for them. They can connect the vocabulary to things in real life. And I just think it's amazing and something I want to try and incorporate into my own lessons as well. Using their native language. This is huge, especially for your level 1 ELs. I welcomed some twins. It was during our virtual year 2020, and they came from Colombia and they spoke no English. And so I spent a lot of time trying to use their native language and then using that to help them learn English. So for instance, this is an app that we had. Unfortunately, we don't have it this year. I'm very sad about that, but you might have it at your school, AV2 World Languages. And for instance, we read about Antarctica in the 2nd grade unit. So I first had them read it in Spanish so they could build that background knowledge just about Antarctica. And then we went back and we read it in English. And because we were able to read it we had read it in Spanish, they could spend less time on just what is it saying and more time on the sentence structure and the grammar and being able to produce language from that. So I also know that Benchmark has some great, Benchmark Adelante has some texts, obviously, that are in Spanish that you can use. I would read the Spanish version with them from Benchmark, and then we would go back and read it in English so that they understood the story. And then, when they went to class, they could talk about the story and they knew about it. So again, it takes time to do this, but it is very powerful for them because if they don't have to worry about understanding the story and they can just focus on the other stuff, then they're going to learn more. Pre-teaching vocabulary, again, takes time, but is very powerful. Obviously, if you've been in the county for any length of time, I'm sure you're familiar with the Freyer model, really breaks down what a word means, examples, non-examples. And then this is what I did just a couple weeks ago. My kindergartners were learning about following the rules, specifically about sports. And so one of the words was gear. So I brought in some sports gear and they got to touch it and feel it as much as they wanted to play baseball in the office. It wasn't going to work, but they were so excited to be able to touch it and see it and use it. And then they were able to use that word gear much more quickly than if I had just kind of shown them a picture or something. So as much as you can bring in real text. I remember when I did, and I keep going back to 2nd grade because for some reason that one jumps out at me, but when we read the text, The Garden, someone in 2nd grade, if you can tell me, well, I forget the name of the text, but it's about how they plant lettuce and that lettuce grows below the ground, the roots grow below the ground, but lettuce itself grows above the ground. So I brought in a head of lettuce and I brought in carrots and I brought in celery, and we actually looked at where the roots were and where things would grow. And that realia was really powerful for them so that they could understand the story. And it was just kind of pre-teaching that vocabulary using the real stuff. Use simple, direct language. When my kindergartners, again, were learning about Mexico for Hispanic Heritage Month, we were talking about food from Mexico. And I said, my original sentence was, have you eaten a tomato before? And they were looking at me kind of with quizzical looks on their faces. And then I revised it to, have you ever had a tomato to eat? And all of a sudden it clicked and most of them, I don't like tomatoes, but just changing the way that I worded my question was that helped them to understand what I was asking. And that made all the difference. So, and it was just spur of the moment. I realized that what I was saying wasn't making sense to them. eaten, that's, of almost a passive form of the verb. So I revised it and it made sense to them. So sometimes it's just on the fly, you realize what you can do to make it more simple and direct. And then I'm sure you guys use these sentence frames. This is one that I used with the Oregon Trail. The journey was blank because the settlers blank. And again, they still have to use that critical thinking. They still have to use content and academic language and what they learned in class, but it takes away some of the challenges and stress by just getting them started. Here is one I did for Stone Soup. This is my two girls, my twins from Columbia. They had to write an entire paragraph on whether they liked the story Stone Soup. And being level ones, that was a little overwhelming, but what I broke it down and we started with a topic sentence. They had to give a reason and then details from the text. And with those sentence frames there, and then they had a concluding sentence so that by the time it was done, they had produced a full paragraph as level one students. And I could tell they were really proud of that. And it was something that they worked hard on. And then finally, body language or total physical response, as we saw in the video at the start of the presentation. This was my fourth graders were learning about natural disasters, and one of them studied tornadoes. And so we got a whole TPR thing on, cold, dry air comes from the north and warm, moist air comes to the south, and it combines. And it got to the point where I could do this and he could just explain it through his words. And so using that total physical response, which you probably do and don't even realize you're doing, but you probably do a good amount, but can be really powerful and beneficial. So those, and I know that was very fast, but those are some strategies you can use. I'm sure you all have some amazing strategies you're using anyway. But to start to wrap up, access testing, which is usually done in January or February. They've been identified, they've been getting this direct ELD instruction. Now we get to testing. And it is a standardized assessment for students in grades K through 12. Even students whose parents refuse services, as I said at the start of the presentation, they must take this assessment. And it does test the 4 domains: reading, writing, speaking, listening, including our kindergartners. Now, kindergarten access must be done individually, and grades 1 through 5 can be done in small groups, depending on the domain. Speaking is done in groups of no more than 5 students because they are speaking into a microphone, into a computer, and if you get more than that, it can be a little challenging to focus. And because they're done in small groups or individually, it can take a few weeks to assess all the students. So I know that when January, February comes and you're wondering why your ELD teachers aren't able to pull as consistently as they normally do, that would be why. Results are shared in late May or early June, and then students who score 4.5 or higher are exited from the program. And this is what the score results would look like. This is a student, if it will come up here. Let me make this bigger. As you can see, they break it down by domain. So listening, speaking, and here you can see the listening, speaking, even reading is high, but then the writing is what pulled the student down. And then you get the oral language, the literacy and comprehension, and you can see how they break down. But then that overall, we're looking for 4.5 or higher. So you can see here that writing, what they can do generally at this level. So this can be really helpful to get an idea of where students are at. And again, we don't get this till June, late May, so it can be beneficial for next year's teachers to see that. Okay, so coming back to the reflection sheet, I'm going to ask you now, you thought of a student, an EML in your classroom. And again, this is not being turned in or anything, but just reflect back upon that student. What is one actionable thing you can do for future work with EMLs? So I'll put the timer on for 1 minute. Just take some time, think about what can you do, maybe what strategy can you use to work with future students, whether they're in your class now or in the future. Okay, about 10 more seconds, start to wrap up. Okay. So I know that was a lot. I know it was very fast, but thank you very much. This went much smoother than last time. Thankfully, my technology worked. So there's a participant survey, and I've been asked if you could, if you're willing to fill it out 2 times, one for my presentation and then one for the overall PLC camp. I will drop that in the chat. Again, if you have any questions, please complete the Google form. I'll be happy to answer as soon as I possible. And then here you can email me if you have any other questions. So thank you, thank you. I'm going to drop the participant survey in the chat, and I hope you have a great rest of your professional development day. Thank you very much. Kind words. Thank you. Let me put the participant survey in the chat. And thank you, and have a great rest of your day.